For the most part, being a carer suited me fine. You could even say it's brought the best out of me. But some people just aren't cut out for it, and for them the whole thing becomes a real struggle. They might start off positively enough, but then comes all that time spent so close to the pain and the worry. And sooner or later, a donor doesn't make it, even though, say, it's only the second donation and no one anticipated complications. When a donor completes like that, out of the blue, it doesn't make much difference what the nurses say to you afterwards, and neither does that letter saying how they're sure you did all you could and to keep up the good work. For a while at least, you're demoralized. Some of us learn pretty quickly how to deal with it, but others, like Laura, say they never do. Then there's the solitude. You grow up surrounded by crowds of people. That's all you've ever known, and suddenly you're a carer. You spend hour after hour on your own, driving across the country, center to center, hospital to hospital, sleeping in overnights, no one to talk to about your worries, no one to just have a laugh with. Now and again you run into a student you know, a carer or donor you recognize from the old days, but there's never much time. You're always in a rush, or else you're too exhausted to have a proper conversation. Soon enough, the long hours, the traveling, the broken sleep have all crept into your being and become part of you, so everyone can see it in your posture, your gaze, the way you move and talk. I don't claim I've been immune to all of this, but I've learned to live with it. Some carers, though, their whole attitude lets them down. A lot of them, you can tell, are just going through the motions, waiting for the day they're told they can stop and become donors. It really gets me, too, the way so many of them shrink the moment they step inside a hospital. They don't know what to say to the white coats, they can't make themselves speak up on behalf of their donors. No wonder they end up feeling frustrated and blaming themselves when things go wrong. I try not to make a nuisance of myself, but I've figured out how to get my voice heard when I have to. And when things go badly, of course I'm upset. But at least I can feel I've done all I could and keep things in perspective. Even the solitude, I've actually grown to quite like. That's not to say I'm not looking forward to a bit more companionship come the end of the year when I'm finished with all of this. But I do like the feeling of getting into my little car, knowing for the next couple of hours I'll have only the roads, the big gray sky, and my daydreams for company. And if I'm in a town somewhere with several minutes to kill, I'll enjoy myself wandering about looking in the shop windows. Here in my bedsit, I've got these 4 desk lamps, each a different color, but all the same design. They have these ribbed necks you can bend whichever way you want. So I might go looking for a shop with another lamp like that in its window. Not to buy, but just to compare with the ones at home. Sometimes I get so immersed in my own company, if I unexpectedly run into someone I know, it's a bit of a shock and it takes me a while to adjust. That's the way it was the morning I was walking across the windswept car park of the service station and spotted Laura sitting behind the wheel of one of the parked cars, looking vacantly toward the motorway. I was still some way away, and just for a second, even though we hadn't met since the cottages 7 years before, I was tempted to ignore her and keep walking. An odd reaction, I know, considering she'd been one of my closest friends. As I say, it might have been partly because I didn't like being bumped out of my daydreams, but also, I suppose, when I saw Laura slumped in her car like that, I saw immediately she'd become one of the carers I've just been describing. And a part of me just didn't want to find out much more about it. But of course I did go to her. There was a chilly wind blowing against me as I walked over to her hatchback, parked away from the other vehicles. Laura was wearing a shapeless blue anorak, and her hair, a lot shorter than before, was sticking to her forehead. When I tapped on her window, she didn't start or even look surprised to see me after all that time. It was almost like she'd been sitting there waiting, if not for me precisely, then for someone more or less like me from the old days. And now I'd shown up, her first thought seemed to be, "At last," because I could see her shoulders move in a kind of sigh. Then, without further ado, she reached over to open the door for me. We talked for about 20 minutes. I didn't leave until the last possible moment. A lot of it was about her, how exhausted she'd been, how difficult one of her donors was, how much she loathed this nurse or that doctor. I waited to see a flash of the old Laura, with the mischievous grin and inevitable wisecrack, but none of that came. She talked faster than she used to, and although she seemed pleased to see me, I sometimes got the impression it wouldn't have mattered much if it wasn't me but someone else, so long as she got to talk. Maybe we both felt there was something dangerous about bringing up the old days, because for ages we avoided any mention of them. In the end, though, we found ourselves talking about Ruth, who Laura had run into at a clinic a few years earlier when Ruth was still a carer. I began quizzing her about how Ruth had been, but she was so unforthcoming. In the end, I said to her, "Look, you must have talked about something." Laura let out a long sigh. "You know how it gets," she said. "We were both in a hurry." Then she added, "Anyway, we hadn't parted the best of friends back at the cottages, so maybe we weren't so delighted to see one another." "Oh, I didn't realize you'd fallen out with her too," I said. She shrugged. "It wasn't any big deal. You remember the way she was back then. If anything, after you left, she got worse. You know, always telling everyone what to do, so I was keeping out of her way, that was all. We never had a big fight or anything. So you haven't seen her since then?" "No, funny, but I've never even glimpsed her." "Yeah, it is funny," she said. "You'd think we'd all run into each other much more. I've seen Hannah a few times and Michael." Then she said, "I heard this rumor that Ruth had a really bad first donation. Just a rumor, but I heard it more than once." "I heard that too," I said. "Oh, poor Ruth." We were quiet for a moment, then Laura asked, "Is it right, Kathy, that they let you choose your donors now?" She'd not asked in the accusing way people do sometimes, so I nodded and said, "Not every time, but I did well with a few donors, so yeah, I get to have a say every now and then." "If you can choose," Laura said, "why don't you become Ruth's carer?" I shrugged. "I've thought about it, but I'm not sure it's such a great idea." Laura looked puzzled. "But you and Ruth, you were so close." "Yeah, I suppose so, but like with you, Laura, she and I weren't such great friends by the end." "Oh, but that was back then. She's had a bad time, and I've heard she's had trouble with her carers, too. They've had to change them around a lot for her." "Not surprising, really," I said. "Can you imagine being Ruth's carer?" Laura laughed, and for a second a look came into her eyes that made me think she was finally going to come out with a crack. But then the light died, and she just went on sitting there looking tired. We talked a little more about Laura's problems, in particular about a certain nursing sister who seemed to have it in for her. Then it was time for me to go, and I reached for the door and was telling her we'd have to talk more the next time we met. But we were both of us by then acutely aware of something we'd not yet mentioned, and I think we both sensed there'd be something wrong about us parting like that. In fact, I'm pretty sure now, at that moment, our minds were running along exactly the same lines. Then she said, "It's weird, thinking it's all gone now." I turned in my seat to face her again. "Yeah, it's really strange," I said. "I can't really believe it's not there anymore." "It's so weird," Laura said. "I suppose it shouldn't make any difference to me now, but somehow it does." I said, "I know what you mean." It was that exchange when we finally mentioned the closing of Hailsham that suddenly brought us close again, and we hugged quite spontaneously, not so much to comfort one another, but as a way of affirming Hailsham, the fact that it was still there in both our memories. Then I had to hurry off to my own car. I'd first started hearing rumors about Hailsham closing a year or so before that meeting with Laura in the car park. I'd been talking to a donor or a carer, and they'd bring it up in passing, like they expected me to know all about it. "You were at Hailsham, weren't you? So is it really true?" That sort of thing. Then one day I was coming out of a clinic in Suffolk and ran into Roger, who'd been in the year below, and he told me with complete certainty it was about to happen. Hailsham was going to close any day, and there were plans to sell the house and grounds to a hotel chain. I remember my first response when he told me this. I said, "But what'll happen to all the students?" Roger obviously thought I'd meant the ones still there, the little ones dependent on their guardians, and he put on a troubled face and began speculating how they'd have to be transferred to other houses around the country, even though some of these would be a far cry from Hailsham. But of course, that wasn't what I'd meant. I'd meant us, all the students who'd grown up with me and were now spread across the country, carers and donors, all separated now, but still somehow linked by the place we'd come from. That same night, trying to get to sleep in an overnight, I kept thinking about something that had happened to me a few days earlier. I'd been in a seaside town in North Wales. It had been raining hard all morning, but after lunch it had stopped and the sun had come out a bit. I was walking back to where I'd left my car along one of those straight, long seafront roads. There was hardly anyone else about, so I could see an unbroken line of wet paving stones stretching on in front of me. Then after a while, a van pulled up, maybe 30 yards ahead of me, and a man got out dressed as a clown. He opened the back of the van and took out a bunch of helium balloons, about a dozen of them, and for a moment he was holding the balloons in one hand while he bent down and rummaged about in his vehicle with the other. As I came closer, I could see the balloons had faces and shaped ears, and they looked like a little tribe, bobbing in the air above their owner, waiting for him. Then the clown straightened, closed up his van, and started walking in the same direction I was walking, several paces ahead of me, a small suitcase in one hand, the balloons in the other. The seafront continued long and straight, and I was walking behind him for what seemed like ages. Sometimes I felt awkward about it, and I even thought the clown might turn and say something. But since that was the way I had to go, there wasn't much else I could do. So we just kept walking, the clown and me, on and on along the deserted pavements still wet from the morning. And all the time, the balloons were bumping and grinning down at me. Every so often I could see the man's fist where all the balloon strings converged, and I could see he had them securely twisted together and in a tight grip. Even so, I kept worrying that one of the strings would come unraveled and a single balloon would sail off up into that cloudy sky. Lying awake that night after what Roger had told me, I kept seeing those balloons again. I thought about Hailsham closing and how it was like someone coming along with a pair of shears and snipping the balloon strings just where they entwined above the man's fist. Once that happened, there'd be no real sense in which those balloons belonged with each other anymore. When he was telling me about the news, Roger had made a remark saying he supposed it wouldn't make so much difference to the likes of us anymore. And in certain ways he might have been right, but it was unnerving to think things weren't still going on back there just as always. That people like Miss Geraldine say weren't leading groups of juniors around the North playing field. In the months after that talk with Roger, I kept thinking about it a lot, about Hailsham closing and all the implications. And it started to dawn on me, I suppose, that a lot of things I'd always assumed I'd plenty of time to get around to doing, I might now have to act on pretty soon or else let them go forever. It's not that I started to panic exactly, but it definitely felt like Hailsham's going away had shifted everything around us. That's why when Laura said to me that day about my becoming Ruth's carer, it had such an impact on me even though I'd stonewalled her at the time. It was almost like a part of me had already made that decision, and Laura's words had simply pulled away a veil that had been covering it over. I first turned up at Ruth's Recovery Center in Dover, the modern one with the white tiled walls, just a few weeks after that talk with Laura. It had been around 2 months since Ruth's first donation, which, as Laura had said, hadn't gone at all well. When I came into her room, she was sitting on the edge of her bed in her nightdress and gave me a big smile. She got up to give me a hug, but almost immediately sat down again. She told me I was looking better than ever and that my hair suited me really well. I said nice things about her too, and for the next half hour or so, I think we were genuinely delighted to be with each other. We talked about all kinds of things, Hailsham, the cottages, what we'd been doing since then, and it felt like we could talk and talk forever. In other words, it was a really encouraging start, better than I dared expect. Even so, that first time, we didn't say anything about the way we parted. Maybe if we'd tackled it at the start, things would have played out differently. Who knows? As it was, we just skipped over it, and once we'd been talking for a while, it was as if we had agreed to pretend none of that ever happened. That may have been fine as far as that first meeting was concerned, but once I officially became her carer and I began to see her regularly, the sense of something not being right grew stronger and stronger. I developed a routine of coming in 3 or 4 times a week in the late afternoon with mineral water and a pack of her favorite biscuits, and it should have been wonderful, but at the beginning it was anything but that. We'd start talking about something completely innocent, and for no obvious reason we'd come to a halt. Or if we did manage to keep up a conversation, the The longer we went on, the more stilted and guarded it became. Then one afternoon I was coming down the corridor to see her and heard someone in the shower room opposite her door. I guessed it was Ruth in there, so I let myself into her room and was standing waiting for her, looking at the view from her window. About 5 minutes passed, then she came in wrapped in a towel. Now, to be fair, she wasn't expecting me for another hour, and I suppose we all feel a bit vulnerable after a shower with just a towel on. Even so, the look of alarm that went across her face took me aback. I have to explain this a bit. Of course I was expecting her to be a little surprised, but the thing was, after she'd taken it in and seen it was me, there was a clear second, maybe more, when she went on looking at me, if not with fear, then with a real wariness. It was like she'd been waiting and waiting for me to do something to her, and she thought the time had come. The look was gone the next instant, and we just carried on as usual. But that incident gave us both a jolt. It made me realize Ruth didn't trust me. And for all I know, maybe she herself hadn't fully realized it until that moment. In any case, after that day, the atmosphere got even worse. It was like we'd let something out into the open, and far from clearing the air, it had made us more aware than ever of everything that had come between us. It got to the stage where before I went in to see her, I'd sit in my car for several minutes working myself up for the ordeal. After one particular session, when we did all the checks on her in stony silence, then afterwards just sat there in more silence, I was about ready to report to them that it hadn't worked out, that I should stop being Ruth's carer. But then everything changed, and that was because of the boat. God knows how these things work. Sometimes it's a particular joke, sometimes a rumor. It travels from center to center, right the way across the country in a matter of days, and suddenly every donor's talking about it. Well, this time it was to do with this boat. I'd first heard about it from a couple of my donors up in North Wales. Then a few days later, Ruth too started telling me about it. I was just relieved we found something to talk about and encouraged her to go on. This boy on the next floor, she said, his carer's actually been to see it. He says it's not far from the road, so anyone can get to it without much bother. This boat is just sitting there, stranded in the marshes. How did it get there, I asked. How do I know, she said. Maybe they wanted to dump it, whoever owned it. Or maybe sometime when everything was flooded, it just drifted in and got itself beached. Who knows? It's supposed to be this old fishing boat with a little cabin for a couple of fishermen to squeeze into when it's stormy. The next few times I came to see her, she always managed to bring up the boat again. Then one afternoon, when she began telling me how one of the other donors at the center had been taken by her carer to see it, I said to her, look, it's not particularly near, you know. It would take an hour, maybe an hour and a half to drive. She said, I wasn't suggesting anything. I know you've got other donors to worry about. I said, but you'd like to see it? You'd like to see this boat, Ruth? She said, yes, I suppose so. I suppose I would. You spend day after day in this place. Yeah, it'd be good to see something like that. And do you suppose, I said this gently without a hint of sarcasm, if we're driving all that way, we should think about calling in on Tommy? Seeing his center's just down the road from where this boat's supposed to be. Ruth's face didn't show anything at first. I suppose we could think about it, she said. Then she laughed and added, honest, Kath, that wasn't the only reason I've been going on about the boat. I do want to see it for its own sake. All this time in and out of the hospital, then cooped up. Things like that matter more than they once did. But all right, I did know. I knew Tommy was at the Kingsfield Center. Are you sure you want to see him? Yes, she said, no hesitation, looking straight at me. Yes, I do. Then she said quietly, I haven't seen that boy for a long time, not since the cottages. Then at last we talked about Tommy. We didn't go into things in a big way, and I didn't learn much I didn't know already. But I think we both felt better we'd finally brought him up. Ruth told me how by the time she left the cottages the autumn after me, she and Tommy had more or less drifted apart. Since we were going different places to do our training anyway, she said, it didn't seem worth it to split up properly, so we just stayed together until I left. At that stage, we didn't say much more about it than that. As for the trip out to see the boat, I neither agreed nor disagreed. But over the next couple of weeks, Ruth kept bringing it up, and our plan somehow grew firmer until in the end I sent a message to Tommy's carer saying that unless we heard from Tommy telling us not to, we'd show up at the Kingsfield on a particular afternoon the following week. I'd hardly ever been to the Kingsfield in those days, so Ruth and I had to consult the map a number of times on the way, and we still arrived several minutes late. It's not very well appointed as recovery centers go, and if it wasn't for the associations it now has for me, it's not something I'd look forward to visiting. It's out of the way and awkward to get to, and yet when you're there, there's no real sense of peace and quiet. You can always hear traffic on the big roads beyond the fencing, and there's a general feeling they never properly finished converting the place. A lot of the donors' rooms you can't get to with a wheelchair, or else they're too stuffy or too draughty. There aren't nearly enough bathrooms, and the ones there are hard to keep clean, get freezing in winter, and are generally too far from the donors' rooms. The Kingsfield, in other words, falls way short of a place like Ruth Center in Dover, with its gleaming tiles and double-glazed windows that seal at the twist of a handle. Later on, after the Kingsfield became the familiar and precious place it did, I was in one of the admin buildings and came across a framed black and white photo of the place the way it was before it was converted, when it was still a holiday camp. The picture was probably taken in the late 50s or 60s and shows a big rectangular swimming pool with all these happy people splashing about having a great time. It's concrete all around the pool, but people have set up deck chairs and sun loungers, and they've got large parasols to keep them in the shade. When I first saw this, it took me a while to realize I was looking at what the donors now call the square, the place where you drive in when you first arrive at the center. Of course, the pool's filled in now, but the outline's still there, and they've left standing at one end, an example of this unfinished atmosphere, the metal frame for the high diving board. It was only when I saw the photo it occurred to me what the frame was and why it was there. And today, each time I see it, I can't help picturing a swimmer taking a dive off the top only to crash into cement. I might not have easily recognized the square in the photo, except for the white bunker-like two-story buildings in the background on all three visible sides of the pool area. That must have been where the families had their holiday apartments, and though I'd guess the interiors have changed a lot, the outsides look much the same. In some ways, I suppose, the square today isn't so different to what the pool was back then. It's the social hub of the place where donors come out of their rooms for a bit of air and a chat. There are a few wooden picnic benches around the square, but especially when the sun's too hot or it's raining, the donors prefer to gather under the overhanging flat roof of the recreation hall at the far end, behind the old diving board. That afternoon, Ruth and I went to the Kingsfield. It was overcast and a bit chilly, and as we drove into the square, it was deserted except for a group of 6 or 7 shadowy figures underneath that roof. As I brought the car to a stop somewhere over the old pool, which of course I didn't know about then, one figure detached itself from the group and came toward us, and I saw it was Tommy. He had on a faded green tracksuit top and looked about a stone heavier than when I'd last seen him. Beside me, Ruth, for a second, seemed to panic. What do we do? She went. Do we get out? No, let's not get out. Don't move. I don't know what I'd been intending to do, but when Ruth said this, for some reason, without really thinking about it, I just stepped out of the car. Ruth stayed where she was, and that was why when Tommy came up to us, his gaze fell on me, and why it was me he hugged first. I could smell a faint odor of something medical on him which I couldn't identify. Then, though we hadn't said anything to each other, we both sensed Ruth watching us from the car and pulled away. There was a lot of sky reflected in the windscreen, so I couldn't make her out very well, but I got the impression Ruth had on a serious, almost frozen look, like Tommy and I were people in a play she was watching. There was something odd about the look, and it made me uneasy. Then Tommy was walking past me to the car. He opened a rear door, got into the back seat, and then it was my turn to watch them, inside the car, exchanging words, then polite little kisses on the cheeks. Across the square, the donors under the roof were also watching, and though I felt nothing hostile about them, I suddenly wanted to get out of there quickly. But I made myself take my time getting back into the car so that Tommy and Ruth could have a little longer to themselves. We began by driving through narrow, twisting lanes, then we came out into open, featureless country and traveled along a near empty road. What I remember about that part of our trip to the boat was that for the first time in ages, the sun started to shine weakly through the grayness. And whenever I glanced at Ruth beside me, she had on a quiet little smile. As for what we talked about, well, my memory is that we behaved much as if we'd been seeing each other regularly, and there was no need to talk about anything other than what we had immediately in front of us. I asked Tommy if he'd been to see the boat already, and he said no, he hadn't, but a lot of the other donors at the center had. He had a few opportunities, but hadn't taken them. I wasn't not wanting to go, he said, leaning forward from the back. I couldn't be bothered, really. I was going to go once with a couple of others and their carers, but then I got a bit of bleeding and couldn't go anymore. That was ages ago now. I don't get into trouble like that anymore. Then a little further on, as we continued across the empty countryside, Ruth turned right round in her seat until she was facing Tommy and just kept looking at him. She still had on her little smile, but said nothing, and I could see in my mirror Tommy looking distinctly uncomfortable. He kept looking out of the window beside him, then back at her, then back out the window again. After a while, without taking her gaze off him, Ruth started on a rambling anecdote about someone or other, a donor at her center, someone we'd never heard of, and all the time she kept looking at Tommy, the gentle smile never leaving her face. Perhaps because I was getting bored by her anecdote, perhaps because I wanted to help Tommy out, I interrupted after a minute or so, saying, "Yeah, okay, we don't need to hear every last thing about her." I said this without any malice and really hadn't intended anything by it. But even before Ruth paused, almost as I was still speaking, Tommy made a sudden laughing noise, a kind of explosion, a noise I'd never heard him make before. And he said, "That's exactly what I was about to say. I lost track of this a while ago." My eyes were on the road, so I wasn't sure if he addressed me or Ruth. In any case, Ruth stopped talking and slowly turned back in her seat until she was facing the front again. She didn't seem particularly upset, but the smile had gone and her eyes looked far away, fixed somewhere on the sky ahead of us. But I have to be honest, at that instant I wasn't really thinking about Ruth. My heart had done a little leap because in a single stroke and with that little laugh of agreement, it felt as though Tommy and I had come close together again after all these years. I found the turning we needed around 20 minutes after we'd set off from the Kingsfield. We went down a narrow, curving road shrouded by hedges and parked beside a clump of sycamores. I led the way to where the woods began, but then, faced with 3 distinct paths through the trees, had to stop to consult the sheet of directions I brought with me. While I stood there trying to decipher the person's handwriting, I was suddenly conscious of Ruth and Tommy standing behind me, not talking, waiting almost like children to be told which way to go. We entered the woods, and though it was pretty easy walking, I noticed Ruth's breath coming less and less easily. Tommy, by contrast, didn't seem to be experiencing any difficulty, though there was a hint of a limp in his gait. Then we came to a barbed wire fence which was tilted and rusted, the wire itself yanked all over the place. When Ruth saw it, she came to an abrupt halt. "Oh no," she said anxiously, then she turned to me. "You didn't say anything about this. You didn't say we had to get past barbed wire." "It's not going to be difficult," I said. "We can go under it. We just have to hold it for each other." But Ruth looked really upset and didn't move. And it was then, as she stood there, her shoulders rising and falling with her breathing, that Tommy seemed to become aware for the first time just how frail she was. Maybe he'd noticed before and hadn't wanted to take it in. But now he stared at her for a good few seconds. Then I think what happened next, though of course I can't know for certain, was that the both of us, Tommy and I, we remembered what had happened in the car when we more or less ganged up on her. And almost as an instinct, we both went to her. I took an arm, Tommy supported her elbow on the other side, and we began gently guiding her toward the fence. I let go of Ruth only to pass through the fence myself. Then I held up the wire as high as I could, and Tommy and I both helped her through. It wasn't so difficult for her in the end. It was more a confidence thing, and with us there for support, she seemed to lose her fear of the fence. On the other side, she'd actually made a go of helping me hold up the wire for Tommy. He came through without any bother, and Ruth said to him, It's only bending down like that. Sometimes not so clever at it. Tommy was looking sheepish, and I wondered if he was embarrassed by what had just happened, or if he was remembering again our ganging up on Ruth in the car. He nodded toward the trees in front of us and said, "I suppose it's through that way, is that right, Kath?" I glanced at my sheet and began to lead the way again. Further into the trees, it grew quite dark, and the ground became more and more marshy. "Hope we don't get lost," I heard Ruth say to Tommy with a laugh, but I could see a clearing not far away. And now, with time to reflect, I realized why I was so bothered by what had happened in the car. It wasn't simply that we ganged up on Ruth, it was the way she'd just taken it. In the old days, it was inconceivable she'd have let something like that happen without striking back. As this point sunk in, I paused on the path, waited for Ruth and Tommy to catch up, and put my arm around Ruth's shoulders. This didn't seem so soppy. It just looked like carer stuff, because by now there was something uncertain about her walk, and I'd wondered if I'd badly underestimated how weak she still was. Her breathing was getting quite labored, and as we walked together, she'd now and then lurch into me. But then we were through the trees and into the clearing, and we could see the boat. Actually, we hadn't really stepped into a clearing. It was more that the thin woods we'd come through had ended, and now in front of us there was open marshland as far as we could see. The pale sky looked vast, and you could see it reflected every so often in the patches of water breaking up the land. Not so long ago, the woods must have extended further, because you could see here and there the ghostly dead trunks poking out of the soil, most of them broken off only a few feet up. And beyond the dead trunks, maybe 60 yards away, was the boat, sitting beached in the marshes under the weak sun. "Oh, it's just like my friend said it was," Ruth said. "It's really beautiful." We were surrounded by silence, and when we started to move toward the boat, you could hear the squelch under our shoes. Before long, I noticed my feet sinking beneath the tufts of grass and called out, "Okay, this is as far as we can go." The other two who were behind me raised no objection, and when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw Tommy was again holding Ruth by the arm. It was clear, though, this was just to steady her. I took long strides to the nearest dead tree trunk where the soil was firmer and held onto it for balance. Following my example, Tommy and Ruth made their way to another tree trunk, hollow and more emaciated than mine, a short way behind to my left. They perched on either side of it and seemed to settle. Then we gazed at the beached boat. I could now see how its paint was cracking, how the timber frames of the little cabin were crumbling away. It had once been painted a sky blue, but now looked almost white under the sky. "I wonder how it got here," I said. I'd raised my voice to let it get to the others and had expected an echo, but the sound was surprisingly close, like I was in a carpeted room. Then I heard Tommy say behind me, "Maybe this is what Hailsham looks like now. Do you think?" "Why would it look like this?" Ruth sounded genuinely puzzled. "It wouldn't turn into marshland just because it's closed." Tommy said, "I suppose not, wasn't thinking. But I always see Hailsham being like this now. No logic to it. In fact, this is pretty close to the picture in my head. Except there's no boat, of course. It wouldn't be so bad if it's like this now." "That's funny," Ruth said, "because I was having this dream the other morning. I was dreaming I was up in room 14. I knew the whole place had been shut down, but there I was in room 14, and I was looking out of the window, and everything outside was flooded, just like a giant lake. And I could see rubbish floating by under my window, empty drinks cartons, everything. But there wasn't any sense of panic or anything like that. It was nice and tranquil, just like it is here. I knew I wasn't in any danger, that it was only like that because it had closed down. You know," Tommy said, "Meg was at our center for a while. She's left now, gone up north somewhere for her third donation. I never heard how she got on. Have either of you heard?" I shook my head, and when I didn't hear Ruth say anything, turned to look at her. At first, I thought she was still staring at the boat, but then I saw her gaze was on the vapor trail of a plane in the far distance, climbing slowly into the sky. Then she said, "I'll tell you something I heard about Chrissy. I heard she completed during her second donation." "I heard that as well," said Tommy. "It must be right. I heard exactly the same thing. A shame. Only her second as well. Glad that didn't happen to me." "I think it happens much more than they ever tell us," Ruth said. My carer over there, she probably knows that's right, but she won't say. I said, there's no big conspiracy about it, turning back to the boat. Sometimes it happens. It was really sad about Chrissy, but that's not common. They're really careful these days. I bet it happens much more than they tell us, Ruth said again. That's one reason why they keep moving us around between donations. I ran into Rodney once, I said. It wasn't so long after Chrissy completed. I saw him in this clinic up in North Wales. He was doing okay. Oh, I bet he was cut up about Chrissy, though, said Ruth. Then to Tommy, they don't tell you the half of it, you see. Actually, I said, he wasn't too bad about it. He was sad, obviously, but he was okay. They hadn't seen each other for a couple of years anyway. He said he thought Chrissy wouldn't have minded too much, and I suppose he should know. Why would he know, Ruth said. How could he possibly know what Chrissy would have felt, what she would have wanted? It wasn't him on that table trying to cling on to life. How would he know? This flash of anger was more like the old Ruth and made me turn to her again. Maybe it was just the glare in her eyes, but she seemed to be looking back at me with a hard, stern expression. It can't be good, Tommy said, completing at the second donation. Can't be good. I can't believe Rodney was okay about it, Ruth said. You only spoke to him for a few minutes. How can you tell anything from that? Yeah, said Tommy, but if, like Kathy says, they'd already split up, Ruth cut in. That wouldn't make any difference. In some ways, that might have made it worse. I've seen a lot of people in Rodney's position, I said. They do come to terms with it. How would you know, said Ruth. How could you possibly know? You're still a carer. I get to see a lot as a carer, an awful lot. She wouldn't know, would she, Tommy? Not what it's really like. For a moment, we were both looking at Tommy, but he just went on gazing at the boat. Then he said, there was this guy at my center, always worried he wouldn't make it past the second. Used to say he could feel it in his bones, but it all turned out fine. He's just come through his third now, and he's completely all right. He put up a hand to shield his eyes. I wasn't much good as a carer, never learned to drive even. I think that's why the notice from my first came so early. I know it's not supposed to work that way, but I reckon that's what it was. Didn't mind really. I'm a pretty good donor, but I was a lousy carer. No one spoke for a while. Then Ruth said, her voice quieter now, I think I was a pretty decent carer, but 5 years felt about enough for me. I was like you, Tommy. I was pretty much ready when I became a donor. It felt right. After all, it's what we're supposed to be doing, isn't it? I wasn't sure if she expected me to respond to this. She hadn't said it in any obviously leading way, and it's perfectly possible this was a statement she'd come out with just out of habit. It was the sort of thing you heard donors say to each other all the time. When I turned to them again, Tommy still had his hand up to shade his eyes. Pity we can't go closer to that boat, he said. One day when it's drier, maybe we could come back. Well, I'm glad to have seen it, Ruth said. It's really nice, but I think I want to go back now. This wind's quite chilly. Well, at least we've seen it now, Tommy said.